As you said, my name is Michael Cope, and the title of today's presentation is Management Indices that Reflect Foundational Soil Health Principles. So I'll start out with a simple figure here that just shows the number of sites that we sampled sort of by broad types of soil health management practices. We sampled 58 sites that have tillage comparisons in their experiments and 34 sites that have cover crop comparisons. But what I'm noting here in this red text and these red arrows is that these comparisons actually represent about 130 different tillage systems and about 57 different cover cropping systems. So as Dr. Morgan alluded to, the data analyses for assessing these soil health measurements are necessarily complicated. So what I will go through today is just in proposing these management indices is to just go through some specific example challenges that led us to consider this approach. And then we will go into a couple of specific indices we are already using for analyses. So to set this up, I thought I would take the audience through a very small example of the exercise that our team of scientists went through when we first started turning towards data analysis. Here I have a table of 3 of our tillage systems at 3 of our long-term sites. And the first 2 rows are 2 tillage systems that are called conventional tillage. The first in a corn soybean system in Illinois, and the second in a wheat fallow system in Saskatchewan. When we look at their implements over here on the right, we see that these two conventional systems are actually very different. In Illinois, they do spring, disc, and fall moldboard plow implements, and in Saskatchewan, they use a cultivator. And this cultivator is very different and much less disruptive than either a disc or a moldboard plow implement. But again, because of just agronomic or cultural differences, both of these systems are referred to as conventional tillage. We also see oddities in the no-till systems, such as this corn, soybean, wheat study in Pennsylvania, where they use a moldboard plow every 3rd year in this no-till system. Now, there are logical reasons at any individual site for these tillage systems to be named this way. For example, this study in Saskatchewan is in dryland wheat production, where they just have very different tillage systems than in corn and soybean production. So in any case, our first step to address this was to do like many other researchers would do, which is to just recategorize these tillage systems based on the relativity to the other tillage systems at the site. So we at least have a common nomenclature for our analyses. So we use the 3 categories named minimum, moderate, and intense. And these red and green boxes that just appeared in this table represent the decisions that we made on these specific tillage systems. This table is basically the same as the previous slide, but for cover cropping systems. And it shows that we also see potentially confusing cases in cover crop comparisons. Here in this corn, snap bean, acorn, squash rotation in Michigan, they plant rye and or vetch every fall, every August or September, and then they terminate it the following spring before planting. And then in this corn, soybean, wheat rotation in Ontario, they use a red clover cover crop. But when we look at their implementations, we see that this red clover cover crop is only interseeded in the spring in a standing winter wheat crop, and then it's terminated in the fall. And so this cover crop only gets planted every 4th year. So again, these systems are referred to as cover crop systems, but the specific implementation of practices are very different in these 2 systems. So at some point, I'm not sure it was totally our original idea, but we realized it would be convenient to use numbers or a numerical indexing system to represent soil health management practices. I've listed a few points here about why that could be beneficial. Firstly, it would reduce or eliminate ambiguity and subjectivity, such as the examples we just went through. This would eliminate confusion due to cultural or linguistic differences, or just differences in the way folks refer to these practices in different agronomic systems. Next, we can do automated data processing, meaning we can write code and data processing algorithms or applications that operate mostly unsupervised and don't require much or any human intervention to make decisions that, again, could be subjective. But the big question is, could this numerical indexing system increase our understanding of soil health? meaning might it improve the accuracy and precision of models or statistical estimators and help us make better recommendations about soil health measurements and soil health management practices. So the next obvious question would be, if we use a numerical indexing system to represent soil health management practices, where do we even start? I imagine many of us have at least seen or heard of the principles of soil health outlined by the NRCS. If not, you can go on the internet, any web search platform or website, and search the principles of soil health, and the USDA page will pop up first. And so the first is the minimizing soil disturbance. The NRCS actually lists 3 types of disturbance: physical, chemical, and biological. Right now in our database, we can only currently connect this to soil tillage practices. The next principle is continual live plants or roots, which is exactly as it sounds, maximizing the amount of time that live roots are present in the soil. And when we connect this principle to management options in our database, we see there are several potential options to address this principle, such as adjusting crop rotations to include double cropping or using a perennial forage or biomass crop phase in the rotation. And of course, we can always plant cover crops. So what we see with these principles is they make a nice framework that can help us interpret this sort of diversity of systems we have sampled in a smaller number of variables to cut through potential clutter and confusion about soil health management practices. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of these principles to make all of the connections, so we will just stick with these first 2 principles for now and look at the management indices we have developed to see their application. The first, the Soil Physical Disturbance Index, is based on the Soil Tillage Intensity Rating, or STIR. This system and all the information we use were originally developed by the NRCS. You can see down here in the gray below the box on the right, if you just Google farming implements in action, you can find this original document that we used. In the upper left here is the formula and the definition of each letter in the formula. Basically, STIR is a function of a tillage type modifier, the tillage depth, and the percent surface area disturbed. This yields a STIR value for each individual tillage implement. In these pictures on the right, I have some examples of implements with their STIR values. Moldboard plows, of course, have the highest, here 65. And then we look at a typical tandem disc implement that has a STIR value of 39, a subsoiler of 33. And we also recognize STIR values associated with planting because depending on the specific attachments and parameters in this formula, any of these values can vary. And so we can have planting implements that are actually quite a bit more disruptive than others. So what we did was we used an existing list of implements with known STIR values, and then we worked in close consultation with our partnering scientists to get all of the implements listed and matched with known STIR values the best we could. And from this, we form an estimator of the Soil Physical Disturbance Index as the sum of all the STIR values in the previous 5 years divided by 5. So this becomes an estimate of tillage intensity and frequency over the previous 5 years. Next is our live roots index, which is very simple. It is mathematically expressed as the average number of days per year with living roots over the previous 5 years. And for simplicity, we count dormant days as living. In this figure on the right, I have 3 examples of what the timelines look like with their calculated live roots index values. Note these 3 boxes share a common date down here on the x-axis from 2014 through 2018. And simply where you see green in these boxes across these timelines, there are live roots present, and where you do not see green, there are not living roots present. So in the first 2 examples, we have sort of the contrast of traditional no cover crop versus cover cropping systems. And these 2 examples have live roots index values of 142 and 301 respectively. But next we look at this corn, 3 years alfalfa for hay rotation. This is not considered a cover crop treatment, but because it goes into a 3-year phase where they grow a perennial crop uninterrupted for 3 years, that live roots index value at 258 gets pretty close to or may even exceed the live roots index values we see in some of our cover crop systems. So getting back to the question of can these indices tell us anything, I put together a little test data set from these sites in this map to look at relationships. I've applied this spatial filter for several reasons. These sites are sort of a transect of our database where the studies represent a lot of grain production. And SHI is doing a lot of other work with farmer interviews and economic analyses in this area. So it is an area of interest for us and a lot of others. So we will take a quick look at these relationships with these indices at these 42 long-term experimental sites that have 138 experimental management systems, including 53 tillage systems. I made two figures, one for the soil physical disturbance index and one for the live roots index, and the measurement or response variable we're testing here is soil organic carbon. Here we look at these indices or organic carbon difference from the site average or treatment minus the site level average. So we are relating site level differences in the indices to site level differences in soil organic carbon. Organic carbon is still expressed as percent organic carbon. So for example, when we see 0.4% on the y-axis, that indicates 0.4% more carbon in the treatment than the site average. Similarly, on the x-axis, a soil physical disturbance index of -40 indicates the treatment physical disturbance index is 40 less than the site average. And these two red lines make a interval or a band where 90% of our points fall. And what we see are pretty strong trends or relationships between the indices and organic carbon. Higher soil physical disturbance index is associated with lower organic carbon. And over on the right, the more time with live roots in the ground, we see a trend towards higher organic carbon. So we could sit here and talk about these for a while, but this is still fairly raw. There are other components of these systems, such as trials of fertility rates and types that I'm not attempting to account for here. But the real novelty that I would like to point out is that our predictors or the indices in these regressions are real measurable numbers. So instead of just comparing the effects of switching from one system to another, like from conventional tillage to no tillage, we can estimate the impact on the soil health measurement across a continuous gradient of differences in management practices. That, combined with the fact that here we are seeing real relationships, I consider to be sort of strong evidence of proof of concept that these continuous management indices will be useful in understanding the relationship between management practices and soil health outcomes. So wrapping up, we see other indices based on the principles of soil health that may be useful, and we are working to develop or implement. We are looking at soil armor in order to consider crop residue management. Soil armor is a big deal for our sites in Mexico, where we are partnering with CIMMYT. We are also looking at plant diversity. There have been several or many ways folks have expressed diversity in agricultural systems. So we are looking at a couple different methods and trying to find the best fit. Grazing is only represented in a small portion of our database, only about 17 sites, I think. But we may have enough, we think we may have enough information and data to develop an index for grazing. And of course, we do plan to write all of this up in its final form and publish in a peer-reviewed journal. In conclusion, our data analyses in soil health should recognize that cropping systems are made up of many management decisions. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of diversity in agricultural systems. As a statistician, I would say that management decisions behave sort of like a random variable or multiple random variables that don't really fit into nice, clean categories. And these management indices are designed to allow for randomness in specific management decisions while also still reflecting foundational soil health principles. So SHI is going to continue to build on what we saw today. We are using these soil physical disturbance and live roots indices and other analyses and assessing the soil health measurements. And we are developing the other indices that I mentioned as well. And lastly, linking back to the randomness of soil health management decisions, That leaves open a lot of space for farmer innovation to address these principles of soil health, and these management indices will aid us in understanding how practices and farmer innovation can affect soil health. Of course, a very warm thank you to all of our partnering scientists for making this work possible. Not only did they allow us to go out and sample these long-term sites, but have also taken time out of their schedule to provide us with all this detailed management data and to review the data to make sure we get everything right. And of course, none of this would have happened without financial support.